Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning or good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Catherine Costello, and I'm a professor of global refugee and migration law at University College Dublin. I've been based back, I should say, in Ireland just for 2 academic years now, having had a longer career based in Oxford and in Berlin. And it's my great pleasure to be chairing this event today for the Institute of International and European Affairs. As ever, it's casting a spotlight on one of the defining issues of our times, which is how we govern asylum and migration, and really trying to bring a principled framework to bear on this topic, in particular in this era of rising autocratization and polarization around questions of migration and asylum. So it's my great pleasure to be chairing the event and introducing the speaker. The event is entitled Constructing a Solidarity-Based Migration Framework, the Value of the Revised Draft Declaration on International Solidarity as a Corrective to the EU Pact on Migration and Asylum. And a much needed corrective, I should say. And our speaker today, it's a great pleasure to introduce somebody whose scholarship I had long admired before we got to know each other, and who is really one of the foremost international experts on solidarity and international law. Her name is Cecilia Bailliet, and she is a professor of international law at the University of Oslo, where she also directs the master's program. And she's speaking in her capacity as UN independent expert on human rights and international solidarity. She has published a range of really groundbreaking international legal scholarship, transnational, cross-disciplinary scholarship on international solidarity and also on international law for peace, often drawing on insights from Latin American scholarship and practice. And she's also, amongst her many other affiliations, she's the co-chair of the American Society for International Law interest group on Latin America. So I think we have a lot to learn in Europe from practice elsewhere, including in Latin America, and also really in this particular political moment, we really have to think, I think, a lot more deeply about how Europe situates itself in the world, in particular, given that we have a political framework which has now been legally endorsed in the EU Pact on Migration and Asylum, which really sets up a very strong them and us dynamic around migration and asylum. So Cecilia, thank you so much for joining us today. I gather you're going to speak for around 20 minutes and present the insights from this draft declaration, and then you've agreed to take Q&A for the rest of the time that we have together. So I'd invite you to listen carefully, and if you have some questions that you want to pose, be ready to write them in the chat in a nice succinct format, and we'll try to get through as many questions as we can. So over to you, Cecilia, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Catherine, for that kind introduction. It's really a pleasure to be here. I'm just trying to share this presentation. So can you see the slide presentation?
Yes, but maybe in slideshow view. So we just slide you want to present.
Yeah, let's see. I'm having trouble getting into slideshow. Okay, I think I'm going to have to keep it in this form because I can't seem to.
That's fine. We can see the slides perfectly. So yeah.
Okay. Okay. So thank you very much for the Institute for inviting me, because I have always admired Ireland for its commitment to solidarity actions and policies to uphold the enjoyment of human rights by all. And so, as you mentioned, the presentation is going to present the argument that the revised draft Declaration on International Solidarity provides a framework to correct the misunderstanding of solidarity within the EU Pact. So I'm going to take you through the elements of what is an international solidarity, human rights focused asylum mechanism. And I say that it should include the elements of the principle of non-discrimination, provide access to justice, really look at a reversal for externalisation, and always keep the best interest of the child at its core. So what is international solidarity? Well, basically, the UN Secretary General issued a report called A Common Agenda, which declared the international solidarity as serving as a type of foundation for 21st century multilateralism. And this is arguing that the kind of international that we're trying to build is one that is based on values and not a transactional system that would be more in an orientation favored by a multi-order perspective. We're looking at a values-based system that will seek equality between all peoples, and it should be pursued through networks involving states, corporations, academics, civil society groups that will cooperate across regions to diminish polarization and promote trust across the borders. And basically that perspective is promoted by a philosopher who is named Carol Gould. And she actually defines network solidarity as not being top down, but it can also come from the bottom up. And this is very important when we're seeking to legitimize solidarity within diverse cultures and societies. So, but the key element of international solidarity is that you have some expression or action that is demonstrating a social empathy that goes across class or across gender, across group. And it rests on a sort of a celebration of pluralism and diversity. And this is the basis for what we would call a human rights-based international solidarity. So Hauke Brunkhorst, he wrote a very wonderful book on solidarity in which he's saying that to implement this vision of solidarity, we have to protect our institutions, because the idea is that if you're going to engage in solidarity actions, you should be able to access protection from courts or administrative agencies that will be respecting your right to act in full form without penalization. So at the EU level, we see that solidarity has always been recognized as a value and a principle. And within the Charter of Fundamental Rights, you have Title IV. So we have many cases that come from the ECJ and from the European Court of Human Rights that are addressing solidarity as what we call a meta right or an enabling right, because it's looking at related rights that it enables, such as prohibition of child labor, social security, healthcare. But we also see references to solidarity within the articles relating to common asylum and border control. And you know that we have other normative instruments that will refer to solidarity within energy solidarity or security solidarity. So how do we bring solidarity within the framework of human rights? Well, let's turn to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We have celebrated 75 years of this declaration, and I was asked to speak about it to a reporter, so I turned to the document and I looked at Article 1. And then I was just amazed because I realized that solidarity is rooted not only in the Declaration of Human Rights, but it's rooted in Article 1. And let's read it. Article 1 is all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. And this particular sentence, most of us are familiar with because it's the basis of the liberal order that we enjoy, right? There's a second sentence that most of us are not familiar with. And if we read that, we'll see. They are endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood. This is a communitarian orientation. And what it says is that we cannot have freedom or equality or respect for our dignity unless we recognize that there's a horizontal obligation for us to provide the spaces for the enjoyment of those rights. And I argue that that may be one reason why Oxfam has really expressed dismay for a state of total global inequality, is because we haven't focused on the second sentence, that we see a world that is polarized, that is fragmentized, that it's marked by distrust and closed borders. And so solidarity then is the recognition that the second sentence has to be implemented for us to enjoy freedom and equality. So it's a positive corollary to non-discrimination. So solidarity would be the expression of the importance of including people who are not able to enjoy their human rights. So this is applying to people who, because of oppression or marginalization or exclusion, are not able to participate in dialogues for their emancipation. So my first report in my mandate actually was addressing civil society as being the actual engine of international solidarity. And to my dismay, we see an absolute crisis where the civil society actors are under surveillance, they're being prosecuted, and this room for movement is closing. So the reason for that is actually a type of solidarity. And this is Carol Gould again, where she is pointing to the notion of unitary solidarity. This is where groups will engage in the exclusion of others, that they will be trying to protect their own group through xenophobic and nativist narratives. So these are the actions that are eliminating due process rights for migrants and refugees. And we heard in the United States the call to deny the habeas corpus, which is the mother of all human rights. And this really brings to mind, when we bring it back to the European system, that maybe the civil society groups should actually have a campaign calling for a collective habeas corpus for the asylum seekers who have perished at sea, because they a strategic state action that seeks to criminalize humanitarian actors that work to rescue migrants at sea and provide food and medicine and housing and legal aid to migrants. So we see that rescuers are being subjected to administrative measures, and this dates back to 2002. But we know that the facilitation directive is being discussed right now. There is no humanitarian exception. And so many of the NGOs who are working at assisting asylum seekers arriving by sea are finding that they are either being prosecuted in actions that may last for years, with and ending in no actual time placed in detention afterwards, because the charges will be dropped, but also fines placed on their boats, their cars, and their planes. So it's sort of administrative processings that they consider to be harassment. So what they would like is greater normative clarity, that if you are not acting with criminal intent, that if you are acting with the intent to rescue someone, to save someone, that you shouldn't be prosecuted for smuggling or seen as someone who's assisting smuggling. The vagueness in the current normative regulations you could consider to be a form of anti-solidarity. So what we're leading to is that the principle of non-discrimination is the elephant in the room, so to speak, when you're discussing migrant and refugee protection. We know that normatively, the prohibition of racial discrimination is considered a peremptory norm, it's jus cogens. And unfortunately, asylum seekers and migrants are racialized communities, and we see politicians and parties and media groups who openly discuss selection of refugees based on nationality, on religion, on ethnicity, and other identity categories. And they're often using security or vague notions of common values, discriminatory motives that are at the foundation of the actions. And they support policies of systemic reviews of cases from specific nationalities for revocation, for deportation, for cancellation, for separation of families without proper analysis of best interests of the child, and absolutely no reflection on how these formalized structural violence policies violate the basic norm of human dignity. So here you'll see that on the revised draft Declaration of Human Rights and International Solidarity, we put in a very clear, holistic definition of non-discrimination that is intended to be the basis of all processes that would be applied to asylum seekers and refugees. So the EU Pact on Migration and Asylum sets forth a solidarity mechanism that seeks to ameliorate inequalities in responsibility for processing asylum claims by either facilitating state relocation of refugees from what they call disembarkation states, or providing financial aid, or giving in kind staff, technical, or support to the disembarkation countries. But what is striking about the new solidarity mechanism is that it declares that it will primarily focus on relocation or return sponsorship by states. So these EU migration rules, they say, can only be credible if those that don't have the right to stay in the EU are effectively returned. And they worry that only about a third of the people ordered to return actually leave. So they say that this erodes the trust by citizens in the whole system of migration management and adds an incentive for irregular migration. And they say it also supports those staying to precarious conditions and exploitation by the criminal networks. So under the report, return sponsorship, member states would provide all necessary support to the member state under pressure and swiftly return those who have no right to stay, with the supporting member state taking full responsibility if return is not carried out within a set period. So the EU Asylum Pact communication suggests that member states can focus on nationalities where they see a better chance of effecting returns. And this indicates a risk of violation of non-discrimination because policies that have disproportionately prejudicial effects on national groups may be considered discriminatory regardless of intent. And moreover, the ground of nationality requires weighty reasons for differential treatment, especially when intersecting with race, ethnicity, or religion, or we see the security, as I mentioned, as the disguise for ethnic or racialized targeting for exclusion, revocation, or return. So a solidarity approach would require that we look at the legality of the processes from the perspective of non-discrimination, and I call upon judges and lawyers to strengthen analysis of non-discrimination as an element of measuring the arbitrariness of the decisions affecting the migrants and refugees. And I also think that the exclusionary perspective runs completely counter to common sense, because we have an article by Alberto Rizzi, who published in the European Council on Foreign Relations, that Europe's shrinking and aging population actually will only be remedied by facilitating regular channels for migration from other regions, ideally coupled with educational and training programs. So the mechanisms that we're setting up run counter to this. So the Commission is providing guidance on the effective implementation on EU rules on definition and prevention of the facilitation of unauthorized entry, transit, and residence. And the EU is going to strengthen the cooperation with the countries of origin and transit to prevent irregular crossings through the counter-migrant smuggling partnerships with third countries. And Frontex can also provide practical support to develop the partners' border management capacity and to cooperate with partners to optimize voluntary returns. So the NGOs are really concerned with this because they say that states are pursuing the externalisation agreements with third states to process asylum seekers for return, and that this agreement curiously actually states that this is intended to promote solidarity with third states. So this is very, very curious, because those NGOs know very well that the centers that are receiving asylum seekers have been criticized for lacking sufficient hygienic standards, such as insufficient water for bathing, that they are surrounded sometimes with NATO-grade barbed wire, and that children, unfortunately, are at risk of detention. So the revised draft declaration specifically calls for removal of externalization and transfer mechanisms that prevent access to asylum. So we need a creation of regular channels to enable asylum seekers to access regular procedures. So it's really important to remember that neither the Global Migration Compact nor the Global Refugee Compact provide procedural remedies for migrants and refugees. And what this means is that these groups live in a type of abyss in which their ability to enjoy human rights or address violations is completely limited. So the EU Asylum Pact runs a risk of decreasing procedural guarantees due to the strengthening of the border procedures that are fast-track in nature for asylum seekers coming from countries with low recognition rates or considered fraudulent or security risk. And those categories then would need transparent monitoring in order to understand how they're interpreted, how they're applied. We know that, unfortunately, that these standards are intended to restrict access to the member states' territory. And they state that there's no right to enter the EU territory to present an asylum claim. So this is problematic because it can constitute a violation of the principle of non-refoulement that prohibits rejection at the frontier. The stated aim to send a clear signal to smugglers, what it does, it underscores that the asylum seekers are treated as a means and not an end in themselves. So even though they state that they're seeking to guarantee individual assessment and exemption of those most vulnerable at the border procedures, where the guarantees can't be secured, we don't have any clarity as to how we're going to measure the categories of vulnerability. What does that mean? Who's included and who's not included? So an international solidarity approach to migration and refugee processing would place procedural rule of law guarantees as essential elements of access to justice, providing access to claim protection, including the right to claim asylum, the right to interpretation, legal aid, participatory rights, procedural fairness, including independent decision-making, and the right to independent appeal that is not politically determined. And the principle of legality would make general considerations of immigration policies not override fundamental rights such as non-refoulement, the best interests of the child, and non-discrimination. So here, when you're looking at accountability, we set a new standard for accountability where we hold not only states, but also international organizations and non-state actors as responsible for creating spaces for the enjoyment of solidarity. And that means actions involving Frontex or private actors that would be running detention centers or reception centers potentially could be held accountable for blocking either the presentation of solidarity demands by people who are held within these centers or processed, or people who are protesting against their actions. So here, I'm going to turn now to the Convention on the Rights to the Child. And we know that we have had some progress in terms of ECJ cases that have been recognizing non-discrimination rights in relation to also having a sequence that you have to consider the best interest of the child before you will enact an action against a parent. So I think that this non-discrimination, we have to remember that it's a positive obligation to actively implement measures to prevent discrimination against the child based on the parent's status. And this came out in a comment by the Committee on the Rights of the Child and the Committee of Migrant Workers. So when we're looking at the implementation of international solidarity, we envision a situation in which states and NGOs and international actors can actually identify best practice of solidarity protection and present them at the UPR. So I know that the NGOs are calling for improved procedural transparency within the EU Asylum Pact, including they want uniform timeframes and safeguards, the right to appeal, the right to refuse relocation and seek relocation to another member state if rejected by one. And they also want to cap the proportion of alternative solidarity contributions that are being allocated to border management and security. They want those resources to be redirected to asylum and reception systems that will be actually focused on integration and community support initiatives. It'll be interesting to see if there's actually any political will to follow the recommendations by the civil society groups that I think are quite sound. And then in addition to creating the revised draft declaration, I also realized that we needed a visual because I was terrified by the amount of negativity coming out in media, that almost all visions of things involving refugees or migrants are involving degrees of violence and fear. And so I created an international solidarity map, and this is intended to give space to those who are acting in solidarity for refugees and migrants, but also women, environment issues, or peace issues. They can register their actions and they can show that instead of borders and walls, that we actually are connected across regions in order to seek the emancipatory potential of human rights. So that is an international solidarity approach to asylum. Thank you.